Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at opioids, a class of drugs originally derived from the opium poppy. We're going to talk about the history of these drugs, the science of how they work, their potential for abuse, and how we help people recover from addiction. Opioid drugs can be very, very dangerous, but they can also be extremely useful. According to one researcher, and I'm quoting, "To understand the popularity of a medicine that eased, even if only temporarily, coughing, diarrhea, and pain, one only has to consider the living conditions at the time." Until the 20th century, cholera and dysentery regularly ripped through communities, its victims often dying from debilitating diarrhea. Diseases like dropsy, consumption, ague, and rheumatism were very common. Opioids could be used to treat all of these things. But the line between useful treatment and harm is very blurry when it comes to opioids, and while they can be very effective in some respects, they can easily become deadly. The history of opioids are the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. This episode is brought to you in part with generous support from the National Institute of Healthcare Management. Humans have known about opioids and their pain-relieving and euphoria-inducing properties for a long, long time. We've known about them pretty much as long as we've been writing stuff down, and maybe even longer than that. As far back as 3400 BC, records indicate the poppy was grown in Lower Mesopotamia. Sumerians called it hul-gil, or the joy plant. By 1300 BC, Egyptians were growing fields of it, and the opium trade was in full force all over the Mediterranean world. The Greek physician Hippocrates, who you might know from his Hippocratic Oath, used opioids to treat a number of diseases. Alexander the Great brought opium to Persia and India. In the 1300s, though, opium sort of disappeared for a couple centuries in Europe. Evidently, the Holy Inquisition didn't care too much for its use. Opioids had some undesirable social outcomes, like addiction and withdrawal, and besides, it came from foreign lands. And during the Inquisition, anything foreign was pretty much the work of the devil. By the 1500s, though, smoking opium was picking up again in Portugal. Laudanum was invented by Swiss polymath physician Paracelsus in the late 16th century. Paracelsus made his laudanum with a bunch of weird ingredients like crushed pearls and musk, but the real power of it was the potent combination of opium and alcohol. By the 1600s, England started importing opium from colonies in India. By the 1700s, the Dutch and the English were shipping it to China. The Chinese Qing dynasty emperors tried to outlaw opium use, but it was unbelievably popular. And it was extremely profitable for the European merchants who were importing the stuff to China. In fact, it was so profitable that the English were willing to go to war with China not once but twice to keep the opium trade in business. Not only did these wars allow the English to keep the opium trade open in China, they set the stage for European powers to force the Chinese to sign all kinds of unfavorable trade deals. The British got an indefinite lease on Hong Kong, for example, which they would hold on to for over 100 years, not returning the island to Chinese control until 1997. The 19th century saw a lot of advances in the science of opioids. In 1803, Friedrich Serturner in Germany discovered the active ingredient in opium, morphine. He managed to extract this active alkaloid, which allowed for much more potent opioids to enter the market. In 1827, E. Merck & Company began manufacturing morphine commercially, and in 1843, Alexander Wood figured out that you can inject morphine with a syringe. It was 3 times stronger when administered that way. These new opioid drugs had even more analgesic power, but they also had more powerful side effects, including euphoria and the addiction that could result from it. In 1895, Heinrich Dresse of the Bayer Company discovered that diluting morphine with acetals produced a drug with fewer side effects. They coined the term heroin and started producing it commercially a few years later. In the early 1900s, free samples of heroin were sent to morphine addicts by mail to help them quit. As you can imagine, this didn't work out so well. Heroin addiction grew rapidly, and in 1905, Congress banned opium use in the United States. In 1910, the Chinese convinced the British to take down the India-China opium trade. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 took aim at doctors to slow the use of narcotics. About 10 years later, the Treasury Department's Narcotics Division banned all legal narcotics sales. This didn't stop its use, though. An underground economy and drugs arose to meet the demand for illegal opium and heroin throughout the United States. These drugs have become a growing source of profit for organized crime during the 20th century. In 1973, President Nixon had the Justice Department create the Drug Enforcement Administration to bring all the power of drug enforcement into one agency. The war on drugs kicked into high gear. In the 80s and 90s, the United States tried to strangle the drug trade wherever it was flourishing, with arguably little effect. Around this time, the most recent wave of opioid misuse began. In the medical community, the belief that use of opioids to control pain might be safe and effective was gaining traction. In 1980, Dr. Jane Porter argued in the New England Journal of Medicine that only 4 out of 12,000 patients who use narcotics became addicted. Another study published in the journal Pain in 1986 said that only 2 of 24 patients who had used narcotics for years had had any difficulties. This, coupled with a growing recognition that doctors were undertreating pain, led to increased use. By 1996, the American Pain Society labeled pain the 5th vital sign. And any doctor will tell you that pain measurement became an integral part of any clinical visit. The pharmaceutical industry brought their weight to bear as well. They created and marketed new drugs and funded lobbying organizations like the American Academy of Pain Management and the American Pain Society in an attempt to ease the regulation of opioid drugs. But concerns began to arise that pharmaceutical companies and researchers were overstating the safety of these medications. In 2007, the maker of OxyContin pled guilty to misleading regulators, doctors, and patients about the risk of addiction and potential for misuse of the drug. They were forced to pay about $600 million as a result. Other narcotic manufacturers paid huge fines for questionable marketing and misleading claims about safety. In 2003, the New York Times reported that more than 20% of young adults abuse prescription pain medications in the United States. Even so, the drumbeat continued for more and more treatment of pain. Ironically, we've been here before in the United States. This is actually the 3rd wave of opioid abuse in the US. The first occurred in the late 1800s when Bayer started making heroin. It was being used more and more often for a wide variety of health problems. Huge amounts of money were being made, and misuse was rampant. Policy responded by taxing the drugs, regulating their use, and treating addiction more widely. Following World War II, the United States saw a second wave of abuse. Veterans of that war, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War were addicted in large numbers. In response, the government passed laws allowing addicts to be hospitalized involuntarily. Methadone clinics were set up, and the DEA began to respond to the drug trade. Today we face similar problems. Opioids now cause more deaths than any other drugs. People in the United States consume 99% of the world's hydrocodone, 80% of the world's oxycodone, and 65% of the world's hydromorphone. Here's the problem. Pain is real. It's undertreated far too often. But opioids are dangerous, and it's becoming clear that they don't work that well for chronic pain. We need to help people who are addicted curb their overuse and also find alternatives for people who are suffering. Healthcare Triage is supported in part by viewers like you through Patreon.com, a service that allows you to support the show through a monthly donation. We'd especially like to thank our research associates Joe Sevitz and MT and our Surgeon Admiral Sam. Thanks, Joe, MT, and Sam. More information can be found at patreon.com/healthcaretriage.
Before you view our videos, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and tap the bell icon so that you will be the first one to watch when we post new videos. We have heard a lot that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But what do you think about having a beer daily? Or will it matter if it's a glass of wine or even a shot of hard liquor? Well, it's an established fact that drinking too much, even once in a while, is bad for your health. However, there are claims of some positive effects on moderate drinking, but there are uncertainties regarding this, and it totally depends on an individual's situation and intensity of drinking. In America, the alcoholic beverage industry is responsible for more than $400 billion in economic activity every single year. And it's surprising to see how widely alcohol is consumed. It is estimated that 63% of Americans drink liquor, wine, or beer regularly. Have you ever wondered, where does this lead us? Certainly it is packed with tons of health issues. To be specific, let's see 5 major negative effects of alcohol on the human body. Starting with number 1, cancer. According to the National Cancer Institute, there is a strong scientific consensus regarding the link between regular alcohol consumption and several types of cancer. It is estimated that 500,000 people die annually from these kinds of alcohol-related cancers. Number 2. Osteoporosis. Research has shown that drinking as little as 2 ounces of alcohol per day can negatively impact your pancreas, which is an organ responsible for absorbing calcium. And what happens when your body doesn't get the calcium it needs? Your bones gets weaker and the risk of osteoporosis goes up. Being regular alcoholic can also increase your body's production of cortisol and parathyroid, which are 2 hormones that damage your bones, in turn making you more likely to suffer from frequent fractures. Number 3. Depression. Even though alcohol consumption might make you feel alive in the moment, its overall effect is that of a depressant. Drinking even small amounts regularly can rewire your brain and lower its serotonin levels. This is particularly dangerous for people with existing depression. Such individuals are twice as likely to begin drinking, making their symptoms worse. Number 4. Dehydration. Alcohol causes dehydration by decreasing your production of antidiuretic hormone. Your body uses this hormone to absorb water after urination. In its absence, your body loses water faster than it can be replaced. Number 5. Liver damage. Regular drinking, even in small quantities such that it does not produce intoxication, can significantly increase the risk of liver damage. Alcohol stresses the liver, which is responsible for removing harmful substances from your blood. This results in damage and even death of liver cells. Some of the liver-related conditions caused by drinking heavily are alcoholic fatty liver disease, alcoholic hepatitis, and alcoholic cirrhosis. Now that you have seen 5 dangers of drinking alcohol regularly, better stop regular drinks to stay healthy and live longer. Please share the video with your friends and family, so they can also benefit from the information. If you find it helpful, give a thumbs up, and comment your suggestions below. Don't forget to subscribe, to stay healthy with upcoming videos from Health Veins.
Everyone is talking about CBD and THC, which are 2 important chemicals found in marijuana. With marijuana legalization becoming mainstream, what is the actual difference between CBD and THC? Inside you right now, there's a biological pathway at work called the endocannabinoid system that helps regulate your mood, appetite, memory, and pain sensation. THC and CBD, though, hijack this system. This is the chemical structure of THC, also known as tetrahydrocannabinol if you are feeling fancy. And this is the chemical structure of CBD, also known as cannabidiol. What you may notice is that their chemical structures seem almost identical. They have the same molecular formula, which is C21H30O2, and both of their masses clock in at 314 grams per mole. But there is one extremely important structural difference. Where THC contains a cyclic ring, CBD contains a hydroxyl group, and this difference in biochemistry actually controls whether or not you feel high. In order to fully understand why, you need to first know about the CB1 receptor. In your unstoned, sober body, your CB1 receptor is affected by a neurotransmitter called anandamide, which controls generation of pleasure, motivation, and feeding behavior. In your unstoned body, anandamide is released after exercising, and it's what causes a runner's high. THC's structure is so similar to anandamide that it fits in perfectly to the CB1 receptor, therefore causing you to feel high. CBD, on the other hand, because of the hydroxyl group, is different in shape and does not fit into the CB1 receptor, therefore it doesn't make you feel high. But CBD does bind to other receptors in your cannabinoid system, affecting you in other ways. A lot of excitement came around a 2011 study where a few dozen people with social anxiety disorder were asked to speak in front of a large audience. Some were given CBD, some were given a placebo. Those who were given CBD reported significantly less anxiety. There are also many animal studies showing CBD's anti-anxiety and anti-inflammatory properties, which can explain why some people say it helps with their anxiety and with chronic pain. Research is also discovering that THC can actually aggravate psychotic symptoms, while CBD, on the other hand, may help with psychosis. So what happens when you consume them at the same time? One study found that due to CBD's biochemical shape, it can actually bind to the CB1 receptor and turn it off in a binding pattern known to biologists as allosteric inhibition. This means that CBD actually makes the THC unable to bind as well and therefore decreases how high you feel. If you vaporize marijuana with 25% THC and 0.1% CBD, you will feel high, as the THC is going to bind to the CB1 receptor with little interference from CBD. If you consume marijuana with 25% THC and 12% CBD, this more CBD will inhibit the THC from binding to the CB1 receptor, decreasing THC's effect and leading you to being less high. Where marijuana is legally sold, likely they will indicate what percentage of THC and CBD is in the product you are choosing, which will help you to understand the effects it will have on your body. In the end, THC is a chemical found in marijuana with a chemical structure that makes you feel high. CBD is a chemical found in marijuana with a different chemical structure that doesn't make you feel high, but it can affect your body in other less obvious ways. There is still conflicting research and a lot more to understand about both chemicals. With more states and countries legalizing marijuana, hopefully increased research can uncover more details about how these two chemicals affect us. Because weed is now legal in Canada, we created a new series called Stone Science, where we make comedians get high and try to explain complex science concepts. Our first episode is about the respiratory system, so click here to watch it and let us know what you think as we continue to evolve this new idea.
We're continuing our in-depth look at the class of drugs known as opioids. How do they work? What's the science behind them? That's the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. This episode and our entire opioid series are brought to you in part by the generous support of the National Institute for Healthcare Management. We all know that analgesia, or pain relief, is the intended use of opioids like morphine. But before we can talk about how these compounds reduce pain, we need to discuss the physiology of pain perception. Let's start with some biology. The brain and the nervous system are made up of cells called neurons. Each neuron consists of a cell body, which runs the neuron's activity. The cell body has a number of dendrites which come off of it. These are short fibers that receive signals from other neurons and transmit them to the cell body. Also attached to the cell body is an axon, a long fiber that takes messages from the cell body and sends them to other dendrites and from there to other cell bodies. Axons can also end up in other tissues, like muscles, transmitting commands to them as needed. When nerves talk to each other, it's called neurotransmission. They do this by releasing chemical messengers called neurotransmitters across the spaces between cells, which are called synapses. The chemicals are released from the axons and are picked up by specific molecules called receptors in the dendrites. There are different receptors all over the body that send messages to your brain when they're exposed to stimuli. There are temperature receptors that tell you when you're feeling something hot or cold. Mechanical receptors let you know when you're touching something or something is touching you. There are even receptors that detect changes in pH. When stimuli are interpreted as being noxious, meaning that they could cause damage to our tissues, specialized receptors called nociceptors send signals to our brain. Nociceptors are located throughout the body, but we mostly think of them as being in the skin, the walls of organs, and deep within other body tissues like muscles and joints. So if you've ever mashed your finger with a hammer, splashed hot water on yourself while cooking, or rolled your ankle while playing sports, you can thank your nociceptors for sending a message to your brain all about the dumb thing you just did. We commonly refer to this message as pain, but nociceptors are kind of like the first leg of the journey that a pain signal takes to your brain. When we encounter noxious stimuli, like touching a hot stove, an electrical signal is sent up a primary afferent neuron to a part of the spinal cord called the dorsal root ganglion. There, electrical current causes a release of neurotransmitters that pass the pain signal from the primary afferent neuron to a secondary excitatory neuron. There are several neurotransmitters involved in pain signaling, but the major players are glutamate and substance P. The message is then sent up the spinal cord to different parts of the brain where it's interpreted as pain. One area of the brain that receives the signal is the thalamus, which helps give context to the message. The thalamus relays the message to the hypothalamus and limbic system, which help us learn from our pain and avoid touching hot stoves in the future. A downside to these parts of the brain receiving pain messages is that they can modify our behaviors and emotions about pain in ways that can be disruptive. Afraid of getting shots because of a traumatic childhood experience at the doctor's office? Yeah, that's probably not the nurse or pediatrician's fault. You can thank your limbic system for that one. So what does all of this have to do with opioids? Well, the cool thing about opioids is that they inhibit the pain signal at multiple steps in the pathway. They work in the brain, the spinal cord, and even in the periphery. In the brain, opioids have mood-altering effects, cause sedation, and can even decrease the emotional response to pain. Opioids block the signaling from the primary nociceptors to the secondary neurons. Opioids also work on neurons that descend from the brainstem to the spinal cord that function to modulate pain signals. Those descending pathways have fibers that either amplify or inhibit pain signals being sent to the brain. Opioid compounds suppress the fibers amplifying the signal and enhance the fibers that inhibit the signal. There's even evidence that opioids can work peripherally to decrease activation of primary neurons and inhibit immune and inflammatory responses to noxious stimuli. The fact is, opioid medications are so effective at treating acute pain because they attack it from every neurological angle. Let's get even more sciencey and technical for a second and talk about how opioids work with the neurons in the spinal cord. We'll focus on the area where the primary neuron is passing the pain signal to the secondary neuron. Remember, the space where the neurons meet is called the synaptic cleft. The influx of calcium ions causes the release of neurotransmitters into the synapse. Those neurotransmitters will float across the synapse and then bind with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. This initiates a chain of events within the secondary neuron that further propagates the pain signal to the brain. There are specific opioid receptors on both the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron. When an opioid compound attaches to a receptor on the presynaptic neuron, it decreases the amount of calcium ions that can enter the cell, ultimately decreasing the amount of excitatory neurotransmitters that are released into the synapse. Opioids binding to their receptors on the postsynaptic neuron function to decrease the response to any of the neurotransmitters being released from the presynaptic neuron. The end result? Less pain. But wait a second. Why do our nerves have receptors that respond to a compound that miraculously diminishes pain? After all, it doesn't really make sense that mammals would evolve a specific receptor for the sap of the poppy flower. Humans have known about the analgesic effects of opium for millennia, but we wouldn't really be able to explain exactly why we had opioid receptors until the 1970s. It turns out that we have a built-in or endogenous analgesic system that modulates pain signals. These endogenous opioids, like beta endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins, are collectively known as endorphins, a name derived from endogenous morphine. See what they did there? So things are going to get super duper sciencey here. The beta endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins interact with different opioid receptors to varying degrees, but one thing they all have in common is the tetrapeptide sequence tyrosine, glycine, glycine, and phenylalanine, or TYR, GLY, GLY, PHE. This sequence is really important because it's needed for the endogenous opioid to interact chemically with the opioid receptor on a neuron. If this is hard to visualize, think of the opioid receptor as the car's ignition, and the tetrapeptide sequence is the key. If the key fits in the ignition just right, then the opioid receptor will be activated and cause a series of changes in the neuron that decrease the pain signal. Opioid drugs and medications take advantage of this structure-activity relationship. They bind to our opioid receptors in much the same way that endogenous opioids do, but with much more powerful consequences. There are three types of opioid receptors: mu receptors, kappa receptors, and delta receptors. When activated with an opioid agonist, like morphine, hydrocodone, or heroin, they will all produce analgesia, but each one comes with an unpleasant suite of side effects that we often associate with opioid use. Kappa receptor stimulation is associated with hallucinations and dysphorias, an overwhelming sense of dissatisfaction, anxiety, and restlessness. Delta and mu receptor agonism can cause respiratory depression because opioid stimulation in the midbrain suppresses the body's ability to appropriately detect carbon dioxide levels in the body. This can cause a person to simply stop breathing for a period of time. Other unpleasant side effects of opioid drugs are sedation, urinary retention, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, and really bad constipation. One might argue that the most catastrophic side effect of opioids is tolerance, meaning that higher and higher doses are required to get the same level of pain relief. The exact cellular mechanism behind tolerance is unclear, though there are many plausible theories. In any case, opioid tolerance is the harbinger of physical dependence and addiction. And that's the topic of next week's Healthcare Triage. Healthcare Triage is supported in part by viewers like you through Patreon.com, a service that allows you to support the show through a monthly donation. We'd especially like to thank our research associates Joe Sevitz and MT and our Surgeon Admiral Sam. Thanks, Joe, MT, and Sam. More information can be found at patreon.com/healthcaretriage.
In this hot weather, many adults like to drink the occasional beer after work. But what happens if you drink your beer every day? Today, we're going to tell you. Here we go. First, some info on how beer generally affects the body. Approximately 20 minutes after drinking a beer, the usual positive effects set in. You feel light and inspired. In addition, the threshold of fear in addressing strangers decreases. It also means that you act recklessly and assess dangerous situations incorrectly. After 1 hour, dehydration starts, and you have to frequently visit the toilet. Now, instead of quenching your thirst with another beer, one should have a glass of water at this point. The next day, or for example, after 8 to 12 hours, you start to feel the negative effects of beer on the body. Depending on how much you drank, you get a headache, dizziness, and at worst, even strong nausea and chills. If you're watching and already thinking that the one-time consumption of beer already has such effect on the body, then consumption on a daily basis must be worse rather than better. Number 4. Daily beer consumption irritates the mucous membranes and ensures gastric juice secretion. The body reacts with a feeling of heaviness in the stomach. In addition, this can lead to a depressive mood. Number 3. Regular beer consumption becomes fat and hardens the liver. In the long run, this could result in liver cirrhosis. Because the female liver degrades alcohol worse than the male, women are particularly at risk. Number 2. If you drink beer every day, it could cause cancer. These occur in most cases in the oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, rectum, female breast, and so on. In addition, the risk of myocardial disease rises sharply. And finally, number 1. Regular beer consumption changes your personality. Irritability, restlessness, strong jealousy, anxiety, depression, and frequent thoughts of suicide are not uncommon. In addition, many gain weight. This is not only unhealthy, but can have a huge effect on your self-esteem. In conclusion, it should be said that even beer or alcohol is a drug, and a beer a day is known as alcohol dependence, which can be pretty difficult to get out of. It's like any addiction and can increase day by day and get worse. It's therefore important that you take the time to figure it out before it's too late. Now, if you want to know what happens to your body when you stop smoking, you can simply click the video right here in the middle. Otherwise, we wish you a wonderful day. Stay healthy, and until next time, bye-bye.
When we're talking about adults who use marijuana and what impact the drug has on their mental health and intelligence, experts have been unable to make many definitive statements. Health authorities can only really say marijuana might do harmful things to the brain, but that more research is needed. That may be why Americans, according to a recent poll, rank sugar as more harmful than marijuana. Are they wrong? Maybe so. A new report titled Long-Term Effects of Marijuana Use on the Brain is offering fresh evidence that a chronic user's brain undergoes significant structural changes for those who've used marijuana regularly over 6 to 8 years. What kinds of changes? Using MRI scans, researchers compared the brains of 48 frequent marijuana users who took the drug on average 11 times per week to those of 62 non-users. The yellow area on this MRI scan shows the average amount that the gray matter density was diminished in the bilateral orbitofrontal cortex of the marijuana users. This is the part of the brain that's involved in decision-making. At the same time, the MRI shows the marijuana users have greater activity than the control group in another section of the brain, called the forceps minor. This is the white matter that connects the brain's frontal lobes. That means, according to the researchers, the pot smokers have more connections to facilitate communication between these lobes, and the more efficient communication makes it more responsive to the environment. Why would marijuana users have higher connectivity? And isn't that a good thing? Not necessarily. The report suggests this part of the brain may be compensating for gray matter losses. However, the study finds that over years of regular use, those increased connections wither away, meaning the brain may be losing its ability to compensate for lost gray matter. Then what happens? A leading marijuana scientist not involved in this particular study says these long-time users could be at increased risk to be driven by immediate rewards and not looking for more long-term gratification, and may be more vulnerable to mood and anxiety problems. The authors of the study admit they found no correlation between an individual's IQ and reduced gray matter in the orbitofrontal cortex. They don't know whether heavy pot users had less gray matter to begin with, making them more prone to using the drug. And if so, whether marijuana made those structural deficiencies worse. Yet again, the public is told more studies are needed. So at this point, setting aside the emerging consensus among researchers that pot is harmful to the developing brains of adolescents, In places where it's legal, do leading scientists think there should be a warning label on marijuana? Some do. Here's what Krista Lisdahl of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee would have it say. High THC marijuana can cause subtle cognitive deficits, brain structure abnormalities, mood and sleep problems. Daily use is not recommended. Not recommended, at least until the science becomes more conclusive. That's the short answer.
You've heard me rail on healthcare triage about how accidents and guns are huge killers of children. But when it comes to adults, drug overdoses are a much bigger problem. In 2014, about 34,000 adults died in car crashes, and about the same number of deaths resulted from gun violence. But more than 47,000 people died from drug overdoses. This episode is brought to you in part by generous support from the National Institute of Healthcare Management. As we discussed in our last episode, opioids work to alleviate pain, and in the 1990s, when OxyContin, Vicodin, and Percocet arrived, they quickly became popular choices for the treatment of chronic pain. We shouldn't minimize the pain problem in America. A 2011 report from the Institute of Medicine argued that about 100 million people in the United States suffer from chronic pain, almost 1/3 of Americans. Pain is real, and a lot of people are experiencing it. But treatment of pain with opioids can be more harmful in the long run than living with the pain. Worldwide, somewhere between 26 and 34 million people abuse opioids. More than 2 million of them are Americans who are abusing prescription opioids, and nearly 500,000 more are abusing heroin. Research shows prescription opioid abuse is associated with heroin abuse. In 1991, about 76 million prescriptions were dispensed for opioids in the United States. By 2011, this number had peaked to 219 million, pretty much a tripling of prescriptions. With this massive increase in prescriptions, the number of bad outcomes increased as well. Emergency room visits for abuse of prescription opioids went from 145,000 in 2004 to almost 306,000 just 4 years later. Admissions for the treatment of abuses of prescription opioids constituted about 1% of admissions in 1997, and they made up 5% of admissions a decade later. In 1999, about 2,000 people died from heroin, and about 4,000 people died from prescription opioid painkillers. By 2013, the numbers had increased to more than 10,000 for heroin and almost 19,000 for opioids. The problem, of course, is that the same thing that makes opioids powerful is the same thing that makes them so dangerous. They act on the same parts of the brain as heroin and morphine, and if used improperly, i.e. snorting or injecting, the euphoric effects are significantly increased. The numbers are a problem too. If the estimates of 100 million people suffering from chronic pain in the United States are accurate, and we treat many of them with opioids, as was the case, then even if a small percentage of these people became dependent on them, we're talking about a lot of people. In the last episode, we discussed how opioids work to reduce pain, but they also produce a sense of pleasure and well-being. People who experience this sensation tend to like it and want to experience it again. Some formulations of opioids, especially extended release forms, try to minimize this effect. Unfortunately, some people try to get around that by using the drugs in inappropriate ways, again, crushing, snorting, injecting. Because the extended release forms contain higher doses, this places people at even higher risks of complications. Tolerance is a problem as well. With repeated use, opioids lose potency, and users are tempted to increase the dose. This increases the euphoric effect and leaves them more likely to become addicted. Addiction is defined as the compulsive seeking and using of drugs in spite of terrible consequences. Why some people succumb to addiction and others do not is still a point of debate. Some believe that about half of this variability is due to genetic factors. The other half of determinants are more environmental, including mental health, socioeconomic status, and stressors. Although it was debated for some time, it seems to be more and more clear that the increase in the use of opioids has also resulted in an increased use of heroin. Especially among younger adults, there's been a significant increase in the use of heroin nationwide. Heroin is cheaper than opioids in general and easier to buy in some communities. The number of heroin users in the United States almost doubled between 2005, when 380,000 people used it, and 2012, when 670,000 did. And of course, with heroin being illegal and unregulated, it can be contaminated with other drugs, and it's much easier to overdose. When it's used intravenously, it also leaves users at risk for HIV, hepatitis, and other bloodborne diseases. We've been very liberal with our use of opioids. Some reports in pain management settings show that more than 90% of patients treated were given opioids for their chronic pain. But pain management clinics account for a small number of total prescriptions. About 20% of patients in primary care settings were longtime users, and more than 60% received opioids from their primary care provider. Many chronic users were prescribed at least 2 different opioids from at least 3 different providers. Even safer prescriptions carry significant risk. Data from the CDC show that about 80% of prescribed low doses of opioids from a single provider still accounted for about 20% of overdoses in the United States. Patients receiving high-dose prescriptions, still from a single provider, still account for an additional 40% of overdoses. The typical drug-seeking patient who sees multiple doctors and tries to fool them in order to get more drugs accounts for only 40% of overdoses in the United States. There appears to be little evidence that long-acting opioids are better for pain control with less risk for abuse. Many people believe this, though. There's a growing sense that their use leads to quicker escalation to high-dose therapy. It appears that the world is waking up to the problem, though. Recent studies highlight a recognition that opioid abuse is associated with a significant increase in mortality in people in the United States. More and more policymakers are focused on the problem and trying to find solutions. But in the meantime, we need to focus on how to treat those who already have a problem. That's the topic of next week's Healthcare Triage. Healthcare Triage is supported in part by viewers like you through Patreon.com, a service that allows you to support the show through a monthly donation. We'd especially like to thank our research associates Joe Sevitz and MT and our Surgeon Admiral Sam. Thanks, Joe, MT, and Sam. More information can be found at patreon.com/healthcaretriage.
No safe limit. Even 1 drink a day increases risk. Alcohol consumption is responsible for 2.8 million deaths per year across the globe. Alcohol has long been recognized as a leading risk factor for disease burden and has been linked to about 60 acute and chronic diseases via a multitude of mechanisms, both through cumulative consumption and acute intoxication. Cancer is the leading cause of alcohol-related death among people aged 50 years and older. The findings come from the latest version of the Global Burden of Diseases, Injuries, and Risk Factors study. Dr. Emanuela Gakidou of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington is the senior author of the study. Researchers analyzed data on 28 million people from 195 countries to estimate the prevalence of alcohol consumption, the amounts consumed, and the associated harms. The report was published in The Lancet on August 23, 2018. The analysis found that among individuals aged 15 to 49 years, alcohol accounted for around 4% of deaths in women and 12% in men. Tuberculosis and road injuries were the leading causes of death related to alcohol. For those aged 50 years and older, alcohol was linked to 27% of deaths in women and 19% of deaths in men, with cancer the leading cause of alcohol-related death. Just 1 drink a day increased the risk of developing alcohol-related health problems by 0.5%. And drinking 5 drinks a day led to 37% increase in risk. The study found that the combined health risks associated with alcohol increase with any amount of alcohol. There is a strong association between alcohol consumption and the risk of cancer, injuries, and infectious diseases in this study. The new findings echo those from in the 2014 World Cancer Report, which found a dose-or-response relationship between alcohol consumption and certain cancers. The results indicate that alcohol use and its harmful effects on health could become a growing challenge as countries become more developed, and enacting or maintaining strong alcohol control policies will be vital. Alcohol is a colossal global health problem, and small reductions in health-related harms at low levels cancer. Studies have suggested that low-level alcohol consumption may be protective against ischemic heart disease and diabetes. However, such findings have been challenged by recent analyses. Echoing the conclusion that there is no safe level of alcohol, they call for public health policies to reduce population-level consumption to be prioritized. We'll continue.
Hey, it's Lou, and here's the thing. We need to have an honest conversation about marijuana, because right now, in the US at least, we've got two sides, fearmongers and cheerleaders, and lost in the mix is reality. Here's the truth about marijuana. We don't know a ton about it, at least not scientifically, and you can blame the federal government for that. In 1970, Richard Nixon's administration classified marijuana as a Schedule I drug, alongside heroin and meth. Schedule I drugs are deemed to have no medical value. Bo Kilmer, the co-director of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center, told me that makes studying marijuana extremely difficult. In fact, to this day, there's only one place in America that is legally allowed to grow weed for research. That's the University of Mississippi, for whatever reason. And scientists have to jump through a ton of bureaucratic hoops to obtain that pot. Now, with very little academic analysis coming from the scientific community, the government has been the main institutional voice on marijuana. And they've spent generations now shit-talking it for political purposes. In the 1930s, marijuana gave law enforcement officials an excuse as to why they were unable to stop crime. Essentially, what are we supposed to do? These guys are high. There's simply no stopping them. And then Richard Nixon came to office and noticed that many of his enemies, like the counterculture, smoked pot. A war on hippies doesn't sound great, but a war on drugs, well, you can sell that to the law and order crowd. It made Nixon seem strong. Over the years, many politicians and the mainstream media outlets that cover them echoed Nixon's anti-marijuana stance.
We haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects, but they are permanent ill effects. The loss of memory, for example.
Over time, people realized that the government's view was, well, at least overstated. There's a ton of reasons for that realization. A big one, many Americans experimented with pot and realized, oh, this didn't turn me into a criminal, I didn't die, I didn't go insane. And then they started thinking, why are we spending so much money arresting, prosecuting, and jailing people who use marijuana? In fact, a 2013 poll shows that 72% of Americans think that government efforts to enforce marijuana laws cost more than they are worth. Plus, the medical marijuana movement has clearly helped many people, especially cancer patients facing chemotherapy and folks who suffer from chronic pain. So, support for marijuana legalization keeps growing. Quick aside here, this study demonstrates that the more music you listen to, the more likely you are to use marijuana. John Hudak, who wrote Marijuana: A Short History, told me there's long been an association between music and weed. In the 1920s, joints were called jazz cigarettes, and Louis Armstrong's famous song Muggles is about reefer. Anyway, now that weed has become more mainstream and more acceptable, I wonder if we've gone too far in championing the drug. In particular, is the media whitewashing the risks associated with using marijuana?
That can not only heal a multitude of illnesses, it's going to heal the world.
Normal, the pro-marijuana group, keeps a record of newspaper editorial boards nationwide that are anti-marijuana. In the late 1980s, more than 150 were anti-weed. By 2016, that number had shrunk to about 30 or 40. And many of the nation's most prominent papers, like the New York Times, have advocated legalization. Ricardo Baca, the first editor of the first weed section of a mainstream media newspaper, that's the Denver Post, told me that for years, the media was deceived by what essentially amounts to government propaganda about the ills of pot. Now coverage is more balanced, but he does think there's been a bit of an overcorrection. Another pot expert told me there's almost a race to see what millennial-driven outlet could be the most pro-weed. I'm talking about all the glowing pro-marijuana pieces I've seen on Vice and HuffPo and BuzzFeed, and even Bean. One of our first episodes was on weed, and it was pretty positive. But here's my thing. We still don't have a ton of long-term studies on marijuana. The largest academic review of marijuana studies, published in January 2017, states, I quote, "A lack of definitive evidence has resulted in insufficient information on the health implications of cannabis use." While acknowledging that caveat, the academic review did, however, find that smoking cannabis on a regular basis is associated with respiratory problems. Cannabis use is likely to increase the risk of developing schizophrenia and other psychoses. Plus, cannabis use prior to driving increases the risk of being involved in a motor vehicle accident. Now, after looking at all the marijuana literature out there, the first thing that review recommends is that there should be more studies, because in the absence of studies, people turn to anecdotal evidence. A popular CNN documentary featured an epileptic girl whose life was transformed by marijuana. But a fascinating Denver Post series revealed that many epileptic patients experienced false hope from that documentary.
If a family asks me if I recommend marijuana therapy for epilepsy right now, I tell them that I do not.
Some even relocated to Colorado from across the country to access legal medical marijuana, but did not get the desired results. And speaking of anecdotal evidence, let's talk about YouTube. A study has shown that YouTube videos that teach you how to make edibles frequently lack warnings and information on portion size and potency. And that could lead to problematic highs, paranoia, anxiety, chest pains, etc. The other thing that sort of drives me crazy is when people point out that marijuana is safer than alcohol. I definitely understand and accept that argument, but alcohol is clearly very bad for you. It's destroyed lives, it's created a huge drunk driving problem, it has all types of negative health effects. I'm saying this as someone who frequently drinks, love me some IPAs. But come on, alcohol is an extremely low bar. But look, I'm a live your life type of person, and to be clear, I'm no Puritan, I'm not advocating for prohibition or anything. I definitely do a shit ton of stuff that is bad for me, including drinking, eating junk food, indulging in other things. And by and large, I think people can do whatever they want as long as A, they don't hurt others, and B, they understand the consequences and don't deceive themselves into thinking unhealthy behavior is benign. A poll from a few years ago found that 60% of 12th graders think weed isn't harmful. 60% of 12th graders are wrong. Marijuana stunts brain development in young people. There may not be a ton of studies on marijuana, but there's plenty on that fact. So look, if you want to use weed, that's your choice. But understand the risks, the science, and the lack of science. Because self-deception is the worst type of drug. Okay, I'm gonna go live my life. By the way, my last question when I interview experts is always, what's the one mistake you're afraid I'm going to make when I tell this story? This time around, I heard the same thing from multiple people. Do not use puns. It cheapens the discussion. Andrew Matranga, the first journalism professor to focus on marijuana journalism in particular, was really adamant. So I won't do it. But Dushyant's going to come in and read some pun-filled headlines.
Marijuana publications proving to be a pot of gold. Smokeless in Seattle. Hail Mary Jane legalizing marijuana. Joint effort. The FBI reaches out to pot-smoking hackers. Seattle's budding economy, pot tourism. Chris Sims's marijuana denial is dubious at best. Marijuana stocks could be a buzzkill. Yes, we cannabis. That one's real bad. Sanjay Gupta endorses medical marijuana, says the DA is just blowing smoke. The highs and lows of using marijuana. Blunt trauma. Marijuana, the new blood diamond. My cushy new job. The history of cannabis in Colorado, or how the state went to pot. Ex-spy lobbying on weed to no basis. Woolsey represents hemp in uphill fight. Recreational marijuana industries planting roots in Sacramento. High praise. Pot churches proliferate as states ease access to marijuana.
That's enough.
All right, well.
It's important to stress the difference between dependence and addiction. Dependence is the tolerance one develops over time and the withdrawal one suffers after stopping a drug. Addiction is a behavioral disorder that refers to the desire a person feels for the effects of a drug and the loss of control over their lives that they have in order to obtain it. Today we'll be looking at the treatment options available to those who are addicted or dependent on opioids. This is Healthcare Triage. This episode is brought to you in part with generous support from the National Institute of Healthcare Management. A drug addict unfortunately spends much of their day either high or sick. The goal of pharmacotherapy to help with addiction is to reduce the amount of time spent feeling sick without achieving the high. Unfortunately, we don't use this kind of therapy as often as we should. Part of that is economic. We expect insurers and public health groups to fund it, but the savings are realized by society at large. Asking insurers to pay for a program when the goals are a reduction in prison sentences doesn't always make sense to the insurers. Another reason is that therapy isn't well understood. Some people think that using drugs like methadone or buprenorphine is just swapping out one addiction for another. The media hasn't always helped with this perception. The best way to treat addiction is to prevent it. We all knew that too many prescriptions for opioid painkillers were being written. Policies were put in place to try and reduce the number of unnecessary prescriptions. In 2012, Blue Cross Blue Shield in Massachusetts started to require prior authorization for more than a 1-month supply of opioids in a 2-month period. In just a year and a half, this cut the number of prescriptions by more than 6.5 million pills. Another issue is that many still feel like drug addiction is a moral failing rather than a personal and public health issue. Usually treatment begins with detoxification, where we try to beat the cycle of withdrawal. It often continues with rehab, either in the inpatient or outpatient setting, often with pharmacotherapy as well as behavioral therapy. Unfortunately, therapy often doesn't stick. About half of those in rehab relapse. Behavioral treatments work to help patients learn to live without drugs, to overcome cravings, to avoid situations that could make drug use more likely, and to deal with relapses. The objective of treatment is to reduce dependence on drugs, to reduce morbidity and mortality caused by them, to improve mental and physical health, to prevent illicit behavior, and to help people re-enter society. Naltrexone is an antagonist medication, which means that it blocks opioid receptors. When someone is given naltrexone, then the opioids don't really work. It can treat both overdoses and addiction, although it's not as widely used for addiction as people don't take it consistently or tolerate it well. If you stop taking it, you can also get high soon after. Methadone is a synthetic opioid agonist, meaning that it works much like opioids do. It acts on the same receptors in the brains that the other opioids do, and in doing so relieves withdrawal symptoms and reduces cravings for the drugs. Methadone is one of the most popular forms of treatment for addiction. It's been shown in research to reduce hospitalizations and emergency department visits, but those are only the direct costs. If you also include societal costs like low productivity and crime, it's hard to argue that methadone therapy for opioid dependence isn't cost-saving. It's a full mu opioid receptor agonist. It has a slow onset of action and a long elimination half-life, something like 24 to 36 hours. A longer-acting derivative, known as levomethyl acetate, or LAM, exists as well. It is only taken 3 times a week. However, concerns about cardiac effects has made it less widely used than other drugs. Buprenorphine is a partial opioid agonist, meaning that it works both a bit like an agonist and an antagonist. It also reduces cravings and decreases symptoms of withdrawal. A number of randomized controlled trials have shown it to be significantly better than placebo. It's not clear, however, if it's superior to methadone. Buprenorphine is sometimes unfairly characterized, like many of these drugs, as synthetic heroin, but the drug is materially different than illicit opioids. One formulation, Suboxone, differs from other buprenorphine regimens in that it combines naloxone in the formulation, making a euphoric experience from either the buprenorphine or any other opioid pretty much impossible. All of these pharmacotherapy treatments have some problems though. Demand for treatment programs is very high, and many of them have waiting lists. Access to these programs can be especially difficult in rural areas. Even after you get in, they're also very expensive. Insurers don't always pay for drug treatment programs, and many pharmacotherapy programs don't accept insurance even when it's willing to pay. Paying for office visits and medication can be a significant financial burden for those in recovery. It's important to remember that addiction leads to real changes in the brain. Withdrawal leads to real symptoms, including diarrhea, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, aches, pain, and changes in mood. Those are just words, though. The agony of withdrawal is very, very unpleasant, and people will do almost anything to avoid it. Finishing detox relieves the physical effects of addiction and withdrawal, but it's the social factors and psychological effects that lead people to relapse. Long-term maintenance therapy can help. Narcotics Anonymous is a 12-step program with a process to help people overcome addiction. It's abstinence-based, which means that it's opposed to the use of drugs in maintenance therapy. This can, of course, be controversial. Some counseling programs are more compatible with maintenance therapy. These can include cognitive behavioral therapies, like the SMART therapy program, motivational interviewing, and family therapy. Opioid abuse has become such a big problem that treatment is very, very important. Given the significant relapse rates, though, we need to continue to look for new and better ways to treat addiction. Overcoming the stigmas attached to treatment is a good start. Understanding addiction as a change in brain structure, rather than a moral failing, is essential. We also need further research and improvements in maintenance therapies and improved access to the treatments we have. We know we spent a lot of episodes on opioids recently, but they're a real problem for too many Americans. These powerful drugs have been in use by humans for a long time, and they're likely to remain a fixture on the human landscape into the foreseeable future, for better and for worse. Hopefully, a better understanding of how these drugs work, how they can help people, and how they can be dangerous will help us to get to a place where they can be used safely and for a short period of time. Healthcare Triage is supported in part by viewers like you through patreon.com, a service that allows you to support the show through a monthly donation. We'd especially like to thank our research associates Joe Sevitz and MT and our Surgeon Admiral Sam. Thanks, Joe, MT, and Sam. More information can be found at patreon.com/healthcaretriage.